A couple of years ago, someone sent me the ramblings of a madman which I watched on the bus, and then subsequently recorded a low-effort video about. That madman was Whatifalthist. Over the years you've seen me talk about all kinds of insane stuff that he said. We laugh, we find him funny, and maybe sometimes endearing. He's just a guy saying stuff on the internet. Sometimes what he says could be dangerous, but realistically, his words won't have that much of an influence on the world. He's just a YouTuber, right? Calling people like him dangerous is an overreaction, right? In 2024, Whatifalthist started a history podcast called History 102. In late 2024, Whatifalthist released a 10-hour-long 3-part video where he, among other things, said he communes with the spirit world and that Odin spoke to him. I can't tell you what Odin told him to do because it might get me demonetized.
I am Rudyard William Lynch, the man who killed a god.
A couple of months after that, on April 18th, 2025, the richest man in the world, who at the time had the ear of the President of the United States of America, shared an episode of Whatifalthist's History podcast. On May 12th, 2025, he shared the podcast again, calling it a, quote, excellent history show. On June 14th, 2025, Elon Musk started following Whatifalthist on Twitter. The world's richest man gets his history from Whatifalthist.
And now we're a society where if a handful of kids jump off a cliff out of boredom, we're like, oh my God, we needed to intervene to stop them. Like, no, the kids are just stupid. Black people are not indigenous to South Africa. They're the African National Congress, which are basically a communist party, very clearly wanting to take the whites' land. You could die tomorrow. You could die for reasons completely outside of your control. Hi, everybody. Super happy to have you folks here again for another episode of History 102. And hi, Austin. How are you?
Hello. I'm fantastic.
First, I want to thank Incogni for sponsoring this video. Longtime viewers of the channel may have heard me talk about this before because I've been using Incogni for over a year. Everything you do on the internet is tracked and logged, and everything that's tracked and logged can be sold for profit. People looking to profit off of your personal information don't have your best interest in mind. For example, an insurance company could offer you higher rates based on information collected on you and sold to the insurance company by a third-party information broker. Many countries around the world, including the United States and the EU, have data protection regulations in place putting you in charge of your data, letting you tell a company that they can't store your information. Problem is, there's thousands of these companies out there continuously collecting your data, and you'd have to contact each and every one of them to tell them to stop. That's where Incogni comes in. You tell Incogni what information you want removed, and then Incogni sends a lawful request on your behalf to have that information suppressed or removed from these companies' databases. While Incogni informs companies to stop collecting your data, they can't preemptively get every company on Earth, so Incogni provides continuous protection, sending out constant requests to have your data removed. I get a report from Incogni every month on the data they've removed. Here's my most recent privacy report showing that Incogni sent 151 removal requests on my behalf in the past 4 weeks, and 143 of them have been fulfilled by the data broker. 8 of them are awaiting the broker's reply. According to Incogni, if I had filed all of these requests manually with the brokers, the process would have taken me approximately 107 hours. Instead, it took me about 2 minutes over a year ago. If Incogni interests you, be sure to use my discount code FREDA at the link in the description for 60% off the annual plan. That's my name in all capital letters at the link below, or go to incogni.com/FREDA. Before we really get going, I need to introduce you to our new character here, Rudyard's co-host Austin Paget. He's a staunch libertarian, as you might be able to tell from the stylized torch in the background or the Rick and Morty painting. He works in the agricultural technology sector, but used to be employed as fundraising director for the National Libertarian Party of the United States. At the time, his partner was chair of the very same party, and there's a lawsuit that accuses her of self-dealing by hiring her partner Austin Paget. He was paid a sum of $12,000 as fundraising director. I'm going to read his partner's comments on the matter because it's probably the funniest way you could possibly respond to being sued for self-dealing, skimming party funds, and other forms of impropriety. Quote, have you ever played Dungeons & Dragons? Imagine sitting down to play Dungeons & Dragons with a group of people and a few of the players are new and don't know how to play the game. They begin to squabble with the Dungeon Master, and so someone calls a timeout and decides to put together a rules committee to explain how to play the game. Gradually, the real game is abandoned, and the singular focus becomes the rules committee. Each weekend, the players gather together to play the rules instead of the game. That is the crux of this litigation. She has since resigned as chair of the Libertarian Party. If you look this guy up, you'll find him connected to the Mises Institute and so on. All the regular libertarian stuff. The focus of this video will be Whatifalthist's African colonialism episode because it's the one Elon Musk endorsed on Twitter. Whatifalthist discusses South Africa in this episode, and Elon Musk is South African. Elon Musk may be responsible for Trump's brief hyperfixation with the idea that there was a white genocide occurring in South Africa. This was, of course, prior to Musk and Trump's messy breakup, where Musk alleged Trump was on the Epstein list. A lot of things have happened recently. In the video, it takes about a minute before he starts talking about some business school psychology stuff, and he shows immense restraint in how it takes a full 1 minute and 55 seconds before he starts talking about how the left are driven entirely by emotion.
Certain parts of politics today are more elephant, they're more rider. The left is completely controlled by their elephant. The rider just passed out for the left. They openly say that whatever they rationalize, they're just rationalizing random subjective crap.
This isn't entirely out of place in the episode. It links to his thesis, that is, the larger point he's trying to get across.
But I find with African colonialism, there's just this horrific degree of just emotion the second you touch it. And I don't really get why, because if you're European or American, this is something that has very little downstream historic effects on you.
This, of course, is why the French military only 4 days ago, as of recording, ended its permanent military presence in Senegal. Again, 4 days ago. What he means to say by this is that colonial empires in Africa shouldn't concern us in the West, because in the long term it didn't really benefit us much. He intends to argue that wealth in the West did not come from colonial plunder, and that wealth disparity between the global North and the global South is not a result of colonialism. We're going to talk more about why this is silly as we get deeper into the video. But as we spiral down into Whatifalthist's very interesting mind, remember the sort of argument he's trying to present and what he's trying to convince you of.
And my attitude here is like, I don't care. I'm just going to tell you the truth, because the more you dance around it, the more people see weakness and they try to attack you.
They start off talking about the Belgian Congo, which is a slight misnomer because in the period discussed, the entire country was the property of a corporation, of which King Leopold II was CEO. Quoting Lorenzo Veracini from Colonialism, A Global History. Quote, "He had begun his private imperialism in 1876, when he established a public corporation, proclaimed himself CEO, and promised international access. He thus imagined an inclusive type of colonialism, and his employees came indeed from many European countries. The corporate entity he controlled had been awarded the territory in 1885. Leopold's corporation was to undertake a mission to end slavery. In essence, this was what would be considered today a humanitarian NGO. Quote, where a corporate endeavor led by the Belgian King Leopold at the end of the 19th century was ostensibly aimed at terminating slavery in the region, in that instance, a veritable genocide was carried out in the name of abolishing slavery."
A good example of that is even the Leopold narrative. It's a popular example of some of the most horrifying abuses of colonialism with the Belgian Leopold's occupation of the Congo. But I had someone tell me the other day that apparently the rate of hands getting chopped off, which is seen as pretty emblematic of Leopold's terror, decreased drastically after Leopold took over because the Arab slave trade was no longer in charge.
It's pretty shocking to make such a claim and source it to, quote, "somebody told me the other day." That is completely insane. A lot of energy spent on equating the Arab and European slave trades, so as to present a more rosy view of European colonialism or to portray it as not strictly a European phenomenon. Later in the podcast, at the 22-minute mark, they talk about Arab empires having conducted their own sort of colonialism in Africa prior to European arrival. It's important to note that empire building and colonialism are not inherently the same. The Arab slave trade was different to the European one. Quote, "In the Islamic tradition, slavery was perceived as a means of converting non-Muslims." End of quote. It was also very limited in scale. Quote, "The export trade was relatively modest for many centuries before the 15th century, and indeed did not really expand considerably until the 19th century. Exports amounted to a few thousand slaves per year at most times. There were also clearly delineated legal processes towards emancipation for slaves in the Islamic world. Europeans transformed the existing slave trade into something altogether different in scale and purpose. The total volume of the Atlantic slave trade after European arrival surpassed 12.8 million people trafficked. The old African system of slavery, whereby people could be made dependents through war, debt, and so on, was pushed away in favor of exporting slaves into the European slave market. This transformation also made slavery and slaves far more common in African society than they previously had been. European slavery, distinctly from Islamic slavery, transformed slavery from a, quote, marginal feature of society to an important institution."
This is how dedicated I am for this job. I read statistics that 8 million people died in Leopold's atrocities in the Congo. And I read other stats that the Congo's total population was 11 million at the time. And I was looking at that, and I thought, that doesn't add up. It doesn't add up that Leopold's killed 3/4 of the Congo's population. So I studied more, and then I realized those numbers were completely falsified by a leftist academic.
He never says who this supposed leftist academic is. It's very convenient to be able to just point to a communist boogeyman in academia spinning falsehoods whenever something doesn't fit your narrative.
And the way I heard it was he was basically trying to make the colony work, and he was trying to be more European about it, and he was failing. So he eventually resorted back to a lot of the status quo.
He wanted to get very wealthy. His previous plan was to buy Taiwan, and there was this huge rubber craze in Europe due to the invention of the bicycle.
Almost correct. It was due to a slightly more significant invention, electricity. Electrification of the cities and of industry and so on and so forth required rubber. Whatifalthist does mention the atrocities committed by this colonial corporation, but he leaves out a very important factor. The brutal resource extraction with all its horrible methods was motivated by short-term profits. Demand for rubber skyrocketed before supply could be established. Many places in the world can grow rubber, but it doesn't occur in the wild in all these places. Quote, "The Congo witnessed an especially rapacious colonial regime also because Leopold and his advisors knew that the rubber plantations of his competitors in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the tropical world would become productive in only a few years." Quoting Matthew Stannard from Selling the Congo, A History of European Pro-Empire Propaganda and the Making of Belgian Imperialism. Quote, "Leopold himself stashed money away to hide the extent of his Congo profits." In addition to being king, Leopold was a capitalist, doing all the things a capitalist does.
I'm not going to defend Leopold because I think ostensibly he is a horrible person. Where
I
even
agree.
when you remove the leftist narrative, the stuff that remains true is so deeply horrifying. Where Leopold actually wasn't Belgian; he was an ethnic German.
I wish I was recording my live reaction to this when I watched it the first time, because this took me the fuck out. That's the most horrifying thing you could think of at that moment.
If you are a silly person, I do not want you to watch this podcast.
Sorry, man, too late.
Where it's relatively unimportant to the West's historic trajectory, but it's due to the left making a strategic calculation in the mid-20th century in America that they should work with black people to get them more political power. And then this became a religious doctrine for the left, where they're like, we must support the continent with the biggest amount of black people, even if they're not that close to our American black people.
What the fuck is he talking about? Do I factor into this American perspective? It's not about that at all. It's about the long-term effects that colonialism has had on Africa and the societies therein, and about how the institutions of colonialism have adapted to the modern world. There is no shortage of wealth being drained from Africa today.
American and British journalists realized what was happening. It became a huge publicity scandal. And then the Belgian government took the Congo away from Leopold. And this is the part people forget, that the Belgian Congo was considered the most humane colony in Africa after the loss of Leopold, because the Belgians overdid trying to be nice to the Congolese. The Congo was seen as the most humane governance in Africa.
Quoting from King Leopold's Ghost, reports of abuses against gatherers of wild rubber in the Congo did drop off markedly after the Belgian takeover of 1908. In the following years, there was less news of villages burned or of women and children held hostage. Note he says less news. Continuing, there was no more officially sanctioned severing of hands. What lay behind this change, however, was not a kinder and gentler regime brought about by the reformers, but several other developments. One was a gradual shift from wild rubber to cultivated rubber. Another was the introduction of a new method of forcing people to work that drew much less protest from missionaries and humanitarians. Taxes. Harsh taxes forced people to work on plantations harvesting cash crops. Forced labor remained in place. After the First World War, copper, gold, and tin mining grew in the territory. It was legal for mine management to administer lashes. Quote, at the gold mines of Moto on the upper Uele River, records show that 26,579 lashes were administered in the first half of 1920 alone. That's half a year at a single mine complex. Quoting further, this figure was equal to 8 lashes per full-time African worker. Techniques for gathering forced labor for the mines were little different from those employed in Leopold's time. I'm not sure what his source is for the Belgian Congo being the most humane European colony in Africa, he didn't say, but I think it's absurd to say something of the sort without also detailing the ways in which it was still horrifying.
In a lot of ways, the Muslims were colonizing Africa before the Europeans, and the Muslims would have taken a good chunk of Africa if the Europeans weren't there, because Morocco, Oman, and especially Egypt under Muhammad Ali, they were trying to carve up Africa earlier.
Right. And people don't have this in their mental model. Kind of like I mentioned, Leopold taking over slave trade
Yeah.
from the Arabs. People didn't think of the Arabs being there. They thought of it as the Europeans kind of coming into the system.
So I mentioned this earlier, but the Islamic slave trade and outposts settled by Arabs in Africa and other regions and so on have to be viewed as a separate phenomenon to what we term, quote, colonialism. Colonialism and colonization are not the same word for a very good reason. Colonialism refers to a very specific thing. You have Arab forts and outposts across Africa, and you have European forts and outposts across Africa. One of these was the stepping stone to integrating Africa into a world-spanning colonial system. One was not. One of these stimulated capital accumulation at the heart of the developing capitalist system. One did not. One of these divided the entire world between the colonial superpowers of the time with the Treaty of Tordesillas, at a time when colonialism had barely even begun. The other did not. Colonialism is a modern phenomenon, intrinsically linked to the development of world markets, globalization, and therefore capitalism. All of these colonial waves that led to these developments came crashing out of the colonial metropole of Western Europe. At most, one could call these Arab conquests and so on proto-colonial, but even that could be a misnomer because colonialism didn't flow out of the Arab world, it came out of Europe. Austin here keeps trying to portray European colonizers as inheriting an Arab tradition, instead of introducing, most often by force, new traditions of slavery, colonialism, and other forms of social organization to parts of the world that had never ever known these European systems before. He said Leopold II tried to run the colony in a quote more European manner but failed, and by implication reverted to an Arab way of running it. In the period of colonialism that's being discussed, the imperialist scramble, colonialism took on new characteristics also wholly separate from the old Islamic expansions of centuries prior, and the slave trade that had existed in Africa. Quote, during the fifth colonial wave, the colonial or imperial claimants developed a new doctrine of colonial expansion and agreed on it. Now it was the demonstrable existence and operation of the colonial state that was to be the marker of possession, a claim that would entitle its holder to lawfully exclude its competitors. The colonial state had to be in place, and it had to be demonstrably shaping the economy and the social life of the colony. Colonialism now became an exercise in international peer review. The colonial state was a new and powerful transformer of the lives of the colonized. It relocated, adjudicated, allocated, repressed, educated, and most importantly, it exacted tax and other tributes. Quoting from the next page, the lives of the colonized populations were now being transformed like they had never been before. Historians do something called periodization, whereby they divide the past into distinct periods with specific defining characteristics. The defining characteristics of the colonial period are not present in the Arab conquests that are being mentioned here.
Like with the whole mouse utopia thing, which you know is one of the biggest themes of the YouTube channel I have, is like the second people leave grinding poverty, they stop doing anything interesting. You had to have a society where almost all Europeans lived in poverty to get them to conquer the world and have the Industrial Revolution and invent science. And it's hard for us to understand. I think a lot about how for most eras of human history, life was seen as relatively cheap.
This is kind of a strange thing to say, and in fact history demonstrates that it's actually quite the opposite. Grinding poverty traps you and prevents you from doing much more beyond survival. The people inventing these medicines, spearheading these scientific advances and so on, were largely not poor and abused peasants, but highly educated people from the middle class and up. Virtually every major development in human social organization has come as a direct result of advancements leading to more efficient production, which frees up labor hours to be spent on other things. He's not just talking about history here, he's leveraging a critique against contemporary society, which he views as soft, presumably. He's saying back then you had less to lose because your life was meaningless, so you'd take greater risks. He's saying now you have so many comforts you're not going to take risks. Your life is less cheap now. In the present day, a great many people live in grinding poverty already. These people lack access to education, which could unlock much of their potential. They lack the safety net to be able to experiment, fail, and repeat that process without risking their livelihood. The person working 2 minimum wage jobs to pay down their medical debt is unlikely to find the cure for cancer.
Black people are not indigenous to South Africa. They only came pretty briefly before the Europeans did, where they were settlers from further north.
I bet Elon Musk loved this one. This is not what the word indigenous means, and he later does call these very same quote black people the natives, which could have been a slip of the tongue or he's operating on differing definitions of these words. Indigeneity is often misconstrued as the people who originally came from that land, which is an unworkable definition because we all came from somewhere. A whole society and its population didn't spawn somewhere. Before now, there was a past, a history. That history led to the now. It's the things that happened in that history that make one person indigenous and another not. Quote, "Indigenousness is an identity constructed, shaped, and lived in the politicized context of contemporary colonialism. The communities, clans, nations, and tribes we call indigenous peoples are just that, indigenous to the lands they inhabit, in contrast to and in contention with the colonial societies and states that have spread out from Europe and other centers of empire. Note that this definition specifically allows for non-European colonizers or non-white colonizers. One example would be the Japanese." Quoting Colonialism: A Global History. "The natives are only natives in relation to those who were born elsewhere. The indigenous peoples are only indigenous in relation to exogenous settlers, and so on. This is obviously not to deny that all these collectives existed in themselves prior to the colonial encounter. They existed, and often thrived, but not as participants to an unequal relation that reconstituted them. In other words, the appearance of the European colonizer is what made these people indigenous, because what defines the indigenous is their relationship to the colonizer." Virginia actually mentions what Whatifalthist is doing here in his book Settler Colonialism: A Theoretical Overview. Quote, "At times, the indigenous community's very indigeneity is questioned. Black South Africans were thought to have entered the settler space after the Boer treks of the 1830s, and in a different context, but in a similar fashion, Palestinians have also been represented as non-indigenous to Palestine. More generally, indigenous peoples, even Australian Aborigines, are frequently seen as, quote, lost tribes coming from somewhere else."
The entire native population of South Africa, or 90%, died off due to diseases. So the Dutch started settling their own men in South Africa. And it's more useful to see South Africa as like a Canada or America or Australia, this settler colonial society, where the Dutch had to populate and settle it. And interestingly, South Africa could have ended up being majority white in a lot of different timelines.
I'd love for him to explain why they, quote, had to populate and settle it, but instead he goes down a tangent about how he made an alternate history video about how South Africa could have been majority white, which I'm not interested in. I think he might be thinking of these places as completely depopulated and in need of bringing in external manpower for the places to function, which I don't think was the case. If it was, we'd probably have seen different demographics in South Africa, with white people making up more than 7% of the population. I do quite like the fact that he correctly points out that Canada, Australia, South Africa, and so on are settler colonies, though.
In South African politics today, there's this huge dynamic where the ANC or the African National Congress, which are basically a communist party, they're trying to take the farmland away from the whites, which is one of the most potentially disastrous decisions possible.
What he's referencing is the African National Congress's land reform, which is what sparked Elon Musk's accusation of white genocide, which eventually led Donald Trump to offer refugee status to any white South Africans who wanted to flee the country. Only 59 Afrikaners actually resettled in the US under this program. According to the BBC, the white minority comprises 7% of South Africa's total population, but owns 72% of the country's farmland. Additionally, the ANC are far from communist. And then, for some reason, his Libertarian Party co-host, with a Rick and Morty painting in the background, starts going on about his good friend Rhodesian Mike.
And I had a good friend, Mike, I'm forgetting his last name, but I worked with him a bit in Indonesia. He was monitoring a rose plantation, and he was Rhodesian. And he fought in the war back in the day in the helicopter squads, and he got shot in the head. Real crazy, intense war. They were really fighting hard, and he really believed in it, and he was really sad about it, still to this day. So yeah, it's painted as like a white apartheid state, but it was, you know, really a civil war, and most of the people making up the infrastructure and fighters, not all the helicopter squads of the Rhodesian army, were local.
Of course, the majority of the army in the Civil War on both sides is going to be black. The white settler population only accounted for 5% of the country's population, at least according to the CIA, who I think you can trust on this one. Now granted, this is from 1976, so a handful thousand middle-class whites had already left the country, which is not statistically insignificant when the white population at this time numbers only 277,000. 60% of these white people were immigrants who arrived in the country in the post-World War II period from South Africa and the UK. The poor treatment of the African population by the recently arrived white minority very clearly spurred nationalist momentum and led to the inevitable civil war over the fate of what was to become Zimbabwe. Educated African elites had naively wanted to work with the white minority in order to gain some concessions and rights they believed were afforded to them. Quote, "This is clear evidence that they were not, as yet, seeking to overthrow colonial rule in order to replace it with one man, one vote, but were merely asking to be governed well and to be accorded rights and privileges that they thought were due to them as, quote, civilized men and women. It is therefore conceivable that had the white establishment opened opened its doors more widely to the educated elite, the rise of militant African nationalism might have been delayed considerably. It is partly because of the establishment's refusal to promote, quote, equal rights for every civilized man, that the African educated elite became more radicalized and turned to militant nationalism. In 1964, Britain set forth a list of principles that must be adhered to, the sixth of which, no independence before majority rule, was critical in leading Rhodesia to unilaterally declare independence. Independent Rhodesia was a country whose very existence was born out of a desire to maintain white minority rule, and the majority of that white minority had no roots in the country. I don't think Rhodesian Mike here is a very trustworthy source on how Rhodesia wasn't as bad as people say it was. We could listen to the guy who believed in Rhodesia and was sad to see it fall, or maybe the entire international community that refused to acknowledge its independence after Britain instructed it to institute majority rule. Another colloquial word for majority rule is democracy.
Because under apartheid, you had all these race laws, and then with the new regime, they made all these anti-white discrimination laws.
Right. Well, it was a big warning for what was happening in the US, and South Africa was often cited as an example of where the racial rhetoric of the left would go in terms of, adding in their own discrimination from an opposite framework.
Yes.
What the fuck are you talking about? As I just mentioned, the 7% white minority owns 72% of the country's farmland. That doesn't sound like a marginalized population to me. You don't fix this sort of wealth disparity by doing nothing. Expropriation of settler property or wealth isn't being done inherently on the basis of race, but on the categorization of settler, which is not inherently a racial one. It's the same as colonizer and colonized, indigenous and non-indigenous. These words do not mean black and white, African or European. It just so happens that Europe colonized Africa. Hence, the settlers are European and the colonized are African. Deciding to not take measures to rectify this grotesque wealth disparity because the settlers happen to be white would actually be racist. They're saying that anything that targets a population which happens to be white is then racist, which, ironically of course, is racist rhetoric in and of itself, because they're saying white people need special protections. These guys whinge and moan about how the left only sees things in terms of race, gender, etc., and then they go on like this. Tackling wealth inequality would be no less important in a quote black society that was settled by another colonizing quote black minority. It just so happens that largely colonialism flowed out of Europe, and that is the reality we are forced to live in, instead of the fantasy worlds these people occupy.
Cecil Rhodes is a very Nietzschean figure, where he was this poor boy from Britain.
His family were middle-class land and business owners. They were quite comfortable. His dad was a clergyman, and his brothers went to fucking Eton, which is where the children of Tory families go to learn how to become evil in preparation of becoming Prime Minister of Britain.
And Cecil Rhodes was racist even for the era. He was considered insanely racist even for the time. And he was part of all these right-wing British associations. I will judge him for that. But at the same time, on a Nietzschean level, he is somewhat of an admirable figure for this singular guy doing the empire building. It's interesting to see it as a manifestation of great man history.
I just don't know what to say.
The birth rate is crashing faster than any computer models we have. And this is the friggin' elephant in the room. If I had a button where I could drop something on national news every day, it would be the birth rate is crashing so fast that mankind's population is going to completely plummet.
Sociologist Felix Schilk out of the University of Tübingen links this birth rate hysteria to a decadence narrative that frequently reoccurs throughout history in reactionary movements. And he explicitly calls this out as an obsession of Elon Musk's quote daily social media activism. Quote, all these ideas rest on a cyclical perception of time, rise and fall, blossom and decay, apocalypse and palingenesis, meaning a national or ethnic rebirth. In my research, I've analyzed hundreds of German and French neo-fascist magazines. In the end, the data was the same endless repetition of decadence and apocalypticism. I dubbed it conservative crisis narratives. This is Oswald Spengler Decline of the West type stuff, and as longtime viewers know, Whatifalthist has brought up Spengler on more than one occasion. Whatifalthist has brought up innumerable conservative crisis narratives over the years we've watched him, from the risk of an American Civil War to the incel revolution. Schilk, citing American anthropologist Janet Whiteman, argues that these narratives, quote, cannot be taken as a description of a historical situation, nor can it be taken to be a diagnosis of the status of history. Instead, it is a necessarily political denunciation. Quote, every crisis narrative strengthens the call for redeemers. The 2024 election is a last shot to save America, claims Donald Trump. Only the AfD can save Germany, reposts Musk. It's a scalable story. Elon Musk and Whatifalthist are both peddling the story of a looming crisis on the horizon, and the only solution is for the masses to submit to the long-term plans of these CEO philosopher kings, whose business acumen and advanced intelligence make them uniquely suited to save us all. In his vision of the future, the individual does not matter, only the long-term effort to defeat the looming crisis. It's tech bro fascism, a fascism for the 21st century with really ugly aesthetics.
European colonialism in Africa was mostly done for ego reasons. And this is something people struggle with because we have been forced to be Marxists. We're forced to have the Marxist materialist worldview.
Yes, sir, we're winning. In all seriousness, the reason you are, quote, forced to be Marxist is that the contributions to the field of history by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels have been immensely helpful to our understanding of history, something you have to admit regardless of your political persuasion. Material factors are empirical and quantifiable. They easily form the basis of historical narratives without necessitating huge leaps in logic or strange vibes-based commentary. Materialist analysis just works. There's of course room for a whole host of methods and approaches, but this is useful. And materialist analysis isn't incompatible with the idea of a quote ego-based scramble for Africa either, though that's also not really what happened. In fact, what he presents as something that can't really be understood through a materialist lens really easily can be, if you just get your facts in order. Think back to our discussion about Leopold's Congo Free State. What sort of driving material factors can one identify there? Well, for Leopold, for one, there's the rubber profit, which he went to great lengths to extract and then subsequently hide. Why was the rubber extraction so brutal and extensive? Because his competitors were setting up rubber plantations, and so his virtual monopoly would soon be taken from him. He had very little time to get the money he wanted. It wasn't ego that caused the scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference, a new internationally recognized method for colonization was established, which set the prerequisite for an internationally recognized exclusive claim to a territory, an effective colonial governance. Then you had effectively locked out your potential enemies from attaining that territory. This means you have a real material motivation to seek out and take possession of territories which may not otherwise be of any benefit to you, because you want to deny your enemies access to it in case it would benefit him. It wasn't motivated by ego, it was competition over something which was in limited supply. This is material analysis. Once the colonies had all been gobbled up, the empires began to challenge each other's claims to snap colonies out from under each other's nose. Quote, "A new global era of protectionism and tariffs meant that exclusive access to raw materials and markets, and exclusive outlets for excess capital, were now essential."
We are stuck in this mental model that the Europeans had to colonize Africa because they wanted to exploit it. But the reality is that Africa had negligible importance to the Europeans in the late 1800s. For British foreign trade at the start of World War I, the British Empire's at its peak, Africa combined less than 1% of their foreign trade. And this is something people think that, oh, the Western European economies were completely dependent on their colonial empires. No, only 15% of Britain's foreign trade was with the empire. Only a handful of colonies in Africa turned a profit.
Right. I have a way to explain that to the modern audience, which is they did it for the memes.
I really intensely dislike it when people view the peoples of the past as these irrational actors not operating off of concrete and identifiable motivations. They're effectively infantilizing the people of the past right now. Their argument that European colonizers didn't really benefit much from colonizing Africa seems to rely on the idea that they just did that for no reason, which is not a strong argument. Also note how non-specific he is about the timeframes and metrics for importance. He uses foreign trade as a metric for the profitability or usefulness of colonies, but is that the only metric? When he says only select colonies turn a profit, at what time? When? What's the time frame for profit? Was it short-term profit or is it long-term profit? The profitability of a colony could vary greatly over time, being immensely profitable in the short term and unprofitable in the long term, or vice versa. If you extract a lot of short-term profits, that can be reinvested somewhere else, meaning the colony might still be unprofitable, but you still somehow are profiting off of what you got from the colony. Furthermore, he's neglecting to mention who's profiting. This is an era where capitalism really kicks into high gear. These profitable ventures, these industries, were privately owned, or at least a lot of the time. Capitalists made a killing on bringing new consumer goods to European markets from these colonies. We've already talked about Leopold's rubber, and Whatifalthist talked about Cecil Rhodes' diamonds. Of course, the underdeveloped peripheral colonies make up a smaller portion of the colonial empire's economy. They largely don't have the electrified factories and so on that the colonial metropole has. But that colonial periphery still supports a whole host of other economic activity in the colonial metropole. Rubber was extracted in Africa in order to build electrified factories in Europe that improved production in Europe, not in Africa. Coffee and tea was farmed on the cheap in colonies in order to be processed and sold to European buyers by European companies at higher rates of profit. As mentioned, this was a time of protectionism and tariffs, which meant a lot of these raw resources that were vital to much European economic activity could become debilitatingly expensive if you had to import it across a trade barrier. And as we've also mentioned, the investment into Africa to build infrastructure and so on wasn't just to support resource extraction, it was to legitimize your claim to said colonies, due to the new international framework for colonialism. You can waffle on about how these countries were of no benefit to Europe, and if that were the case, which it's not, it would paint Europeans in an even worse light. Why did we install these brutal and repressive regimes if you had nothing to gain? Did we just decide to ravage vast swaths of the world, quote, for the memes, as his co-host says? I don't think so. The Global South was exploited for gain, and this exploitation hampered the Global South's development. The Global South was exploited for gain. Surplus was being extracted from Africa instead of being put to use in developing it.
So whatever rubber company gets in because they got the British military to subsidize a little bit of a sortie, they're getting most of the benefit, not the actual colonial people back home.
He's very close to getting it, he just forgets that the people who are benefiting, the people who own that rubber company, are actually, quote, from back home. The way he's speaking about this makes it sound like he would have preferred a different sort of colonization, not for the profit of private companies, but for the benefit of an ethnic or national community, which I think historically has led us down some very dark paths. But I digress.
So we came up with this excuse, which is that, hey, this is the white man's burden. We're actually helping them. We're not stealing. Look, we're providing them infrastructure and all these other things, and overall benefiting their society, which justifies us looting it, basically.
This part is so funny because for a moment I thought he was starting to become super woke, but then he says this.
If it was profitable, they could hire a little private army and set it up, but they're using the government to subsidize their activity. That's not benefiting the people. They need an excuse. White man's burden. It's the same exact concept as white privilege, where it's not something to an excuse to alleviate guilt. White privilege is specifically meant to generate guilt. It's a guilt generating mechanism to justify government money going to bridges and infrastructures and schools in the South Side instead of the Congo or wherever.
I definitely think Austin is more racist than Whatifalthist, because Whatifalthist says,
and the Ethiopians wiped out an Italian field army at the Battle of Adoma, which completely shocked Europe, because again, the Europeans didn't think the Africans could physically beat them.
And Austin's response is to go, okay, but maybe there's something to that. What if they only won because they were fighting Italians?
Right, it's always a question. Was it the Africans or was it because the Italians are so bad? It's like...
is that they were empires, and empires are always brutal. And there's a great book called The Rule of Empires, and it goes through imperial history. And the thesis of the book is that all empires are basically the same. It compares the Roman conquest of Britain, the French conquest of Italy, the British conquest of Kenya and India. And the thesis is that all empires basically exist to prioritize the conquerors over the conquered. And that's the way things are. And you saw that in Africa, where the Europeans did oppress the Africans.
I don't really understand how he can square this thesis, which he so clearly agrees with his claim that European empires put more money into Africa than they got out of it. Why would the conqueror not prioritize themselves over the conquered, as he says? It feels like there's a right-wing narrative that he's very sympathetic to that's in conflict with the facts that he also knows. It might also be that he was being a little purposefully misleading, because it very well could be that more money was put into Africa than came out of it, being that Europeans only really started extracting taxes to any meaningful degree at the tail end of the history of colonialism. Instead, they were extracting natural resources and slaves before then. So in that sense, more cash went in than came out. But I think his original intent was to portray Europeans as putting more wealth into Africa than they got out of it.
It was an empire, but the Europeans were operating with more moral constraints and more guilt than most empires in history.
Right, and that's when it gets back to an interesting theme like you were talking about with South Africa and Rhodesia. It doesn't matter how nice you are or how good you are. If you have to be authoritarian to secure control, that's going to create backlash, and then it can break down. So the situation is what it is, and you can see that institutional legacy pretty clearly, and that's...
It's incredible watching two guys who are at the very least a little racist, trying to navigate simultaneously thinking slavery and oppression is wrong, and also thinking Rhodesia and the British Empire were kinda cool. Someone I know said Rudyard has a woke soul that's trapped in a chud mind, which I thought was really funny.
For almost all Africans, they were under the same governance before and after colonialism. And a lot of them were slave states, where in most African kingdoms, a majority of the population were slaves.
This is simply not true. As we've discussed, the colonialism of the imperialist scramble around the late 1800s and early 1900s completely transformed these societies. We've also discussed the point about slavery. The European slave trade made slavery far more prevalent across Africa than it had been ever before. The reason these countries in Africa had so many slaves prior to being colonized by Europeans is because Europeans integrated them into a transatlantic slave trade. Quote, "Where slaves had once been an incidental element in society, they now became common." And another quote, "Slavery was transformed, and slave societies emerged." Europeans established and intensified slavery in Africa, and then later abolished it. These things are both true.
Is that after the World Wars, the average European realized that the African colonies didn't benefit them in any major way, so they gave up the empires because they were a drain on Europe's resources. And after the war, the Europeans lost the will to empire.
There was a whole host of reasons for decolonization, and for every instance of decolonization, there were different prevailing factors at play. It was not, by and large, because Europe decided the colonies were a drain, but a different sort of value proposition. It was clear, as the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan proclaimed in 1960 in South Africa, that the wind of change was unstoppable. Anti-colonial movements were developing all over the colonized world, and, quote, "If the African nationalists were more inclined to forcefully demand independence in the 1950s, the imperial powers were less inclined to resist all calls for independence." As mentioned, a whole host of other factors played into this, and the Western political landscape, of course, was very important as well. The potential cost of suppressing these independence movements was also, of course, factored in. But decolonization did not start from the top. It started from the bottom, and the colonizer empires were responding to calls for independence. And many of these decolonization projects eventually led to foreign military interventions in the former colonies to once again protect the interest of colonizer nations, or as part of the superpower competition of the Cold War. Even if empires like the British and French decolonized for real practical material reasons, like the cost of maintaining the empire becoming too great, it was still a decision made with reluctance. Quote, "The imperial powers conceded independence where there were no strategic resources, no strategic implications, no communists or socialist movements ready to take over, and no settlers. But the imperial powers bitterly resisted decolonization everywhere else. When they conceded defeat, they always tried to secure concessions."
They decided to give up Africa, but until very recently, the French kept West Africa as a pseudo-colony called the Franc-Afrique, where they controlled the currency. And France, a few years ago, France was fighting about half a dozen wars across Africa at the same time. And the French just recently gave up the Franc-Afrique, which shows how recent the effects of colonialism were.
Once again, it's like he's desperately trying to cling to these right-wing narratives that he knows deep in his heart are wrong. He talks about how the African colonies had little bearing on the West, but then at the end of the same podcast episode, he talks about how we can see colonialism before our very eyes still today, with France maintaining a very colonial relationship to West African nations still to this day. We're mostly done with the history. Now I'm going to talk more about my opinions. As I've hopefully demonstrated, these guys don't have the greatest grasp on what they're talking about. They do say things that are correct, of course, but a lot of their analysis is muddied by their gripes with leftist academia and all those other strange things they bring up out of nowhere. This is a relatively middling history podcast in my opinion. So what led Elon Musk to endorse it? Why is the world's richest man listening to this stuff? Ask yourself, who's the largest political streamer on Twitch? You'd be forgiven for assuming it's the left-wing political streamer Hassan Piker, who gives talks at universities, is interviewed on news shows, and used to work in news media.
After all, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. Thank you.
And you're over here chirping all the way from fucking London about Palestine and doing a both sides are fucking fine type bullshit.
It's actually this guy.
Oh, I'm not going to cry a fucking river when people who have genocide that's baked into their laws are getting genocided. They are not the same as us. They come from an inferior culture that is horrible. It kills people for their identity, and it is directly antithetical to everything Western values stand for, and it is an inferior culture in all ways.
Asmongold, a former World of Warcraft streamer who only cleaned his house for the first time in years because he got banned for making what I at least perceived as genocidal comments about Palestinians. He's nominally a gaming streamer, but a lot of his content revolves around peddling various right-wing narratives. There's probably an appeal to these kinds of guys, an appeal I'm probably tapping into myself as well. My production value isn't the best. I sometimes say things I probably shouldn't say on Twitter. I'm just a guy. There's a degree of authenticity to it. Whatifalthist's eccentricity, for better or worse, makes him charming and seem authentic. You know there's no scriptwriting room behind the stuff he does, no fleet of professional editors, and he has the aesthetic trappings of also just another guy. Maybe saying things none of the well-groomed talking heads on TV are saying. Aesthetically, maybe it feels a little punk rock, if punk rock had its brain irreversibly altered by a South American psychoactive drug. This sort of content has the aesthetics of something that's far from the halls of power, like just another guy. But as we know, Whatifalthist isn't far from the halls of power. He's listened to and endorsed by what is probably the richest man in the history of mankind. I think whatever sort of vibes Whatifalthist gives off, Elon Musk is into it. Elon Musk portrays himself as someone speaking truth to power, a punk rocker and eccentric rebel, despite again being the richest man in the world who had the ear of the President of the United States. But at the heart of their politics, there is no contradiction between the talking heads on TV and the insane stuff Whatifalthist is saying. The core of their politics is the same. It's far-right conservatism peddling crisis narratives, defending capitalism and the rich and tearing down workers and worker movements. This brings me to the second part of why I think these people are so successful compared to other guys who are clearly better at this than them. Up until 1981 in Norway, the government had a monopoly on mass media technology like radio and TV. In 1981, the new right-wing government opened the doors to private for-profit actors to provide multiple channels on TV. For-profit actors tend to have politics that align with their profit motive. Regulations and other systems of oversight can assure these right-wing media corporations behave to an extent. This has largely worked in Norway with TV. Such regulation is virtually non-existent in the social media sphere. Elon Musk's generative AI model Grok was recently deemed too woke and biased to the left. Musk tried to correct it, and it led Grok to declare itself Mecha Hitler and post-Holocaust denial. Who owns your social media? It's shareholder investors, also known as capitalists. Examples of this would be YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, or Reddit. Sometimes they're majority owned by one man, such as Twitter, which is owned by Elon Musk, or Truth Social, which is owned by the President of the United States of America. Alternative social media includes things like Bluesky, which is still a for-profit corporation, but a so-called public benefit corporation, who, instead of maximizing shareholder value, have a responsibility to balance this against the public good. Bluesky had 10 million active users in the last 90 days. Compare that to some of the other platforms. According to Stacey Jo Dixon, Facebook has 3 billion monthly active users, YouTube has 2.5 billion, Reddit has 606 million, Twitter 506 million. Truth Social has something like 6 million monthly active users as of 2024. That feels comparable to Bluesky's 10 million over 90 days. It's harder to get statistics for these two websites, and I don't know how reliable these stats are. But it's striking to me that the social media platform dedicated exclusively to the sort of American right-wing politics espoused by its owner Donald J. Trump has a comparable user base to the global website that's not totally for-profit. And mind you, it's still a for-profit website. The best we're getting is a balance between profit and responsibility. The digital landscape is a world owned by the right wing. The workplaces are owned by for-profit investors, and the politics of private profit are the politics of the right. When people like Whatifalthist talk about the leftist UN world order, understand how silly they're being. When people talk about how the left runs the media, they're lying. Especially when people like Elon Musk, a man who owns the media, says it. The politics espoused by people like me and you are diametrically opposed to the people who own the places where we speak to one another, whereas the politics espoused by people like Whatifalthist are supportive of the owners. The roads to the halls of power are a lot shorter for those backing the people in power. It's a lot harder for those who want to see the people in power overthrown. We have to acknowledge that fact, but there's no reason to despair. Though the right wing thrives in the media ecosystem of its own creation, the actual material base of their politics, that is, the people who own the factories, shares in AI startups, and so on, are very few compared to the people who do wage labor to survive. The vast majority of the user base on social media are workers, people who have very different material motivations from the shareholders and capitalists out there. On social media, you are the content from which the shareholders profit. If they push the majority of people away, then there's no profit. So even though the right owns these platforms, they have to allow the politics of the vast majority, that is, left-wing politics, space to breathe. So just like how the owner has to put a bunch of workers close to one another on the factory floor, so too does the owner of the platform have to let regular people talk to one another. And that gives us the opportunity to talk about things he doesn't like. Thank you for watching, and special thank you to the patrons at the $10 tier. The History Enjoyer, Spyron C, Garion, Gil the Gilded Dragon, Young Jin S, Jesse F, Keenan F, Lucanus F, Hengamer, Gwiggan, Vishire, Jordan M, and Monday's Last Brain Cell. Thank you all so much.